We want to look at the relationship between philosophy and theology. That's our general interest, but specifically, we are going to look at today and the ensuing sessions Saint Thomas Aquinas' views on what is philosophy and what is theology, and the relationship and different types of theologies, and the relationship between philosophy and theology. Okay, so we want to look at the relationship between philosophy, relationship between philosophy and theology. Okay, and by theology here we mean Christian theology, because this because in Islamic disciplines we have Ilm al-Kalam, which is close to theology, but it's not theology per se. And one of the great Christian thinkers who actually problematize and discuss this relationship is Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas is obviously important in his own right, but we are interested in his thought because it has bearing on our understanding of the relationship between a religious civilization and an anti-religious civilization or non-religious civilization. And Thomas Aquinas' stance on a relationship between Greek civilization and Roman civilization and the Christian civilization is an important step or contrast to, for example, Imam Ghazali's understanding of Islamic civilization and its relationship with Greek civilization and other non-Islamic civilization. And I think one of the key difference between the Islamic history and the Christian history is that we had Ghazali and Thomas Aquinas as the greatest defender or theorizer of the relationship between a Christian civilization and alien civilization. Anyway, and I have initially picked up Father Copplestone's History of Philosophy, because he's a Thomist. Oh, I think that's what to call it, Thomist or Thomist. He's a follower of Thomas Aquinas in his philosophical and theological. He's a Catholic priest. He was anyway, and he's a philosopher. Like he knows Aquinas' philosophy inside out, but he's also, schooled and well versed in modern philosophy. He wrote one of the most popular history of philosophy, which starts from Greek philosophy, and I think it ends in 20th century somewhere in modern French philosophy. And he is a believing Catholic, so a believing Thomist. So it's good to get someone who is a believing Christian who is a specialist on Copleston as well as specialist in modern philosophy. But he's also he has written a lot on the relationship between philosophy and theology. So that's why I picked up Copleston, and we will be using it as a sounding board basically to understand the relationship between philosophy and theology. And types of philosophies, obviously, and different conceptions of philosophies and different conception of theology, that will come afterwards. Okay, so let's go back to the text. So Saint Thomas Aquinas made a formal and explicit distinction between dogmatic theology and philosophy. Is an undoubted and indubitable fact. Okay, so there are two important terms there, dogmatic theology and philosophy. So let's first try to understand them. In fact, at this point, we just need to understand the difference between theology and why did he use dogmatic theology, the word dogmatic. So theo obviously means God, and theology literally means study of God. And Aristotle actually called his first philosophy theology. He called it first philosophy, he called it, people have called it metaphysics, but metaphysics, first philosophy, and theology are basically the same thing in Aristotle, because we don't need to go into the detail of Aristotle's philosophy here, but suffice to say is that for Aristotle, the main problem in his metaphysics is to explain motion, metaphysics and physics, to explain motion. And the way he explained the origin of motion is through his distinctions between, on the one hand, matter and form, and on the other hand, through potentiality and actuality. And what he explains the motion ultimately is through his conception of God. And matter is identified with potentiality, and form is identified with actuality, and ultimately pure actuality for him, which is the source of all motion, not causally but teleologically, and he calls it God. And God, in that sense, is the source of motion, and the God is the source of explanation of how matter and form combined together at different levels, and so on. So in that sense, theology was the study of, if theology was the study of God, for Aristotle it's the higher science, because it ultimately explains what metaphysics and physics can't explain on their own. That is motion in the world. And that was and God in him is the end of everything in the sense of telos. So it's the most pure being, and the substance of substance, in the sense that it is a substance which combines, because the God is the substance which is eternal, and it is immovable, even though it is the source of all the movement. And it is separable in the sense that it exists, it's self-sufficient. It exists on its own. No other substance in our physical world or even in metaphysical world contains all these three properties, three as properties. And since this substance is theos, that is God, study of this substance is theology. And if this substance is the most perfect substance, then this is the most important branch of sciences according to him. But the thing to remember about Aristotle theology is that for him God is the principle which, or the being which he posits to explain something which he cannot explain in his physics and metaphysics on its own, and that is motion and self-sufficiency. And it is a conception which is quite distinct or quite different from the person of God, the conception of God put forward in traditional Abrahamic inspired religion, including Christianity. And the other thing is this sort of theology also purportedly use only reason, so it's not based on any reliance on something other than reason, for example revelation or faith or whatever. So in that sense this theology of philosophical theology or natural theology. Philosophical theology is differentiated from dogmatic theology in these two things. The conception is, even though dogmatic theology and philosophical theology both use reason, dogmatic theology also relies on revelation and faith to get the basic of its basic data. So that's what differentiates dogmatic theology supposedly from philosophical or natural theology. So dogmatic theology is a theology which uses reason to understand systematize, defend, justifies religious beliefs about God and other ensuing beliefs. So it uses reason to do that, but it gets its basic data from revelation and faith. On the other hand, natural theology mainly exclusively relies on reason. So that's the basic distinction, but I think there's also a distinction between their conception of God. And that's something which is not emphasized enough, I think, and so we'll try to emphasize this while we study or think about these matters. Okay, go back to the text then. So St. Thomas Aquinas made a formal and explicit distinction between dogmatic theology and philosophy, an undoubted and an indubitable fact. And the distinction between dogmatic theology and philosophy is the same as the distinction between dogmatic theology and natural theology we talked about. Okay, we'll stop here and we'll continue from here.